Welcome to this video on classifying data and asset. As a CISSP, you will be expected to understand how to identify and classify both information and assets. Now, what does this really mean for us? What this really mean is that we understand how to identify, track and manage organizational assets throughout their entire life cycle. So that's both data and also the resources and other things like that. The way what we go about identifying asset is first of all understanding the specific type of data that is being used within the organization. Certainly within the system, but also within the organization. So that includes physical copies as well. And we want to account for private information, private data, sensitive data, and any kind of regulated data as well. One of the best reference I can recommend for data classification is the NIST Special Publication 860 specifically. Volume 2 deals with all of the different data types, but both volume 1 and 2 would be beneficial if you need to learn how to identify and classify assets. And above anything, everything starts with knowing your inventory. What do you have? What do you have within the organization? What kind of data you have? What kind of asset do you have? How critical are they to the organization? It's important to have a solid inventory list of hardware, software and other assets like that. And also we want to clearly understand what kind of policies exist in the organization as it pertains to data. From the governance, regulation and compliance standpoint, we want to understand how data created in the organization and how it is collected, whether it be in the system or physically collected, and how we manage that throughout its entire life cycle. We also want to understand the quality of the data as it pertains to the organization as well. We want to make sure that we understand the authenticity of the data, the reliability of the data, things like that. And lastly, we want to certainly understand the sensitivity of the data. What level of protection is needed for the particular data. And going back to the NIST Special Publication 860 will definitely help in this regard. Specifically, Volume 2 will help you understand the general sensitivity of most data types that are out there within information system. So when we are talking about assets, remember that it's not always firewall or switches or what you have. There are a lot of different things that come into play. So for example, what kind of data lives here on this storage server? Where does the data move from that storage server? Does that data move over to the web server? That might be in demilitarized zone, or it might be in some other kind of area of the system. And what assets are by that transaction? Maybe the application server over here is making the transaction from web server to send the data over. And so now we have three different servers that are being impacted by one data transaction. Does that make sense? So what really important is to understand both of the data flow, but also what about the data? What if this sensitive data that's sitting on this store server and now it's moving to the DMZ? The DMZ is rather untrusted area. We have to have proper protection in place and those kind of things. That's why it's important for us to understand this asset as well as the data. That way, as the data moves from in use to in transit to at rest, we can protect it at all data states. And what about data that's being sent over the wireless network or radio frequencies? So we need to understand what kind of data is actually going out there. What assets are being used to transmit this data over the wireless network? Things like that. And then also anything that we are sharing outside to the open internet externally from the company, from the organization, what's leaving our system and how valuable is that data. And that will determine the security controls that we apply to the data before we release it to the external environment. Now, the data policy that we talked about earlier is going to define how data going to be created, how it is collected, how it is processed, how it is managed. All of those different things, the data policy must align with law, regulation, and industry standard. Whatever we are doing, if we are collecting PII, personal identifiable information, or PII as it's called, if we are collecting that information, there are regulations, there are laws that apply to how we collect and how we process the data. So we need to clearly understand that piece. We also want to define what data or assets are sensitive and also the level of protection that's required. So going all the way back to the scenario that I was just showing you, that exactly what we are looking at, understanding the data and understanding the data flow throughout the system, and then being able to pretty much label the data to understand where it's going from point A to point B, and then what protection are needed in that regard. Establishing the data policy is very important for the organization. It proves compliance, due diligence, it demonstrates a lot of different things. It also plays a significant role in data governance, how we protect the data and how we are managing the data. And a well-defined policy will provide direction for the management, set practices, standard related to the quality, the formatting, the accessibility, and also the retention of the data itself. And it will also establish roles and responsibilities such as data owner, the data custodian, the data steward, and so on. Now, when it comes to sensitive data, there's a few different types you need to know for the CISSP exam. And I just mentioned one of them, which is personally identifiable information, PII, or PI data that can uniquely identify any individual. Now there are a lot of different standards, there are a lot of different ways to describe what PII can or cannot be. At the end, all you want to know is that this data can uniquely identify an individual, whether it be an account number, whether it be an ID number, whether it be some other kind of license number, a medical record, something like that, because that will tie that information back to a person. And if the person doesn't want the data disclosed, then we have violated their privacy. And that's the main driver behind PII. There's also PHI. Now that goes specifically within health information, protected health information. And it's normally regulated through things like HIPAA, and there's other regulation as well. This is health related information about a specific individual. Another type of sensitive data is proprietary data. This will give an organization an advantage over a competing company or organization in their market space. Some other type of sensitive data to be aware of for the exam are national security information. This apply to nation security, government, or military. This is often military action, top secret information, things like that. They are sensitive business information. This applies to private businesses. They are sensitive user information, and this applies to organizational user. They are also regulated information, and it's required to be protected by law. Now, when you understand the type of data you have, now come to the time where you are going to categorize the data. You are going to bucketize, or you are going to otherwise label this data. So you can recognize how sensitive this data is and how it needs to be protected. So the data categorization is going to reflect the value and impact of the data type as it pertains to the organization. Categorization typically relates a classification or sensitivity level to the data type itself. For example, if we are looking at just an overall categorization matrix, let's say we have system log. System log could be considered moderate in terms of confidentiality. There are things in log that you don't want people to see. There are things like log that doesn't really matter if they see it. However, if they were to change those logs, that would be a huge impact, because an intruder or an attacker could possibly cover their tracks from a breach, a compromise, some unauthorized action. Maybe people were changing. Hey, we are going to some websites that we are not supposed to go to, and now they are deleting that from their history. Things like that. So we are talking integrity at this point, and we want to maintain that integrity. Also, system log. If you are working in a security operation center, you want those logs to be available at all the time with 99.9% uptime. So availability comes into play, and that's going to be a high. But then going down to something like customer service information, maybe these are just common calls that come into your organization. You don't really treat them as valuable as other information. Someone calls in and they are complaining about a product. We don't really need to keep that too confidential. So we will provide low protection for that, and then same with integrity. It's okay if somebody makes an update or change, not a big deal. That calls record in another place as well. So we have got some resiliency there. Things like that. Training information, same kind of thing. Now you can go on and on with all the different data types that you have on an information system and categorize them this way. But as you can see, just from a quick look, you can quickly see that this is starting to look like a heat map. What very important, what's not. And NIST SP 860 volume 2 will help you to categorize them using this exact method. It will give you a general recommendation for those data type, and you can tailor those. You can increase the label or decrease the label depending on your organization. And once you have categorized this data, now you can assign classification label based on the categorization or based on the impact level. From the national security standpoint, obviously everyone's aware of top secret information. It's in every movie, James Bond and all those different movies. Top secret information basically mean that it is very high impact type information. It can cause grave or severe damage if it was disclosed to unauthorized person. Meaning, if you have a top secret information that was disclosed to enemies, that would severely damage your plant. It would severely damage your military or your nation secret. That's why it is considered the most valuable type of information in the national security space. Things like nuclear weapon, intelligence operation, special operation, Navy SEALs and such. These are just example of top secret information. Below that you have secret information. Now, if this information got disclosed, it would cause serious damage, but it would not be severe or grave, but it would be a serious. It would make a very serious impact, and it's considered very valuable information. Things like military, aircraft feature, base location, secret base location, anyway, battle plant. And these were the example of secret information. The next level down would be confidential. If this was disclosed, it would be a moderate damage to the nation or to the military if it was disclosed. That means the information is valuable. It's not very valuable. It's not really valuable. It's just valuable. Meeting with foreign dignitaries, foreign representatives, sensitive relationship with the government. These are the example of confidential information. And then the lowest level of classification would be unclassified, meaning if it was disclosed to the unauthorized parties, there would be no damages involved, and there's minimal value that it pertains to the unclassified information, such as things that are publicly accessible on website, things like that. The existence of military units, military branches, functions within the military, public announcement that they release, things like that. That's an example of unclassified. Now, on the other hand, there are civilian classification that are used in the business world, where we have top secret information. Instead, we have proprietary or confidential information. Again, if this was disclosed, This would cause grave damage to an organization because it is their most valuable information. This could be like a acquisition strategies, who we are buying things from, technology development, vulnerability assessment report. Those kind of things could be the most valuable information to the organization. The next level down being private or most private. This would be cause serious damage. Things like business processes and procedure, PII information, financial information, those are the example of private information. And then we have sensitive information as the next level down. That would cause minimal damage if disclosed. This would be employee pay or compensation, employee reviews, internal company announcement that you don't want out in the open environment. Those kind of things would be treated as sensitive. And then lastly, we have public information. This would cause no damage. These are like public releases, website information, marketing and advertisement, those kind of things. For the CISSP exam, remember that sensitive information typically refers to any information that is not public. Now, on the asset side of thing, there's no data involved. So we can't really classify them as a top secret, proprietary, that kind of stuff. So what we normally do is we use a tier system to classify the different assets so that we can understand the importance within the organization. Starting with just our essential assets. These are the tier 0 asset. This is servers, databases, enterprise network devices. Going up the next level to the tier 1, these are important assets like our development environments, our backup assets, our data backups, local network devices. This would be considered tier 1. Then we have tier 2, which is non-essential. These are workstation, mobile devices, printer and so on. And then we have significant systems, and the significant system are things that are required to be compliant with governance, regulation, compliance, things like FISMA, PCI-DSS, HIPAA, GDPR and so on. Now, significant system can tie back to mobile devices. It can tie back to the databases. It can tie back to the sum of these other assets. But if they are required to be compliant, they would automatically be treated as significant and then handled as such. And why we want to go ahead and classify things like this is to, one, have a good accurate understanding of our data and asset inventory. Again, what I said earlier about inventory being so important, it could not be further from the truth. It is so important to understand what asset you have in the system and what kind of data in the system as well, and that you accurately understand what those things are. It is also increases the security awareness. It gives you situational awareness of security risk within the organization. It helps with compliance in terms of policy, regulation and standards. And it also helps with the forecasting or planning business continuity and disaster recovery. In business continuity, you are identifying those important and critical assets through the organization as well as the data that's going to need to be ported over to say a disaster recovery backup sites. So this will help with that as well. So the bottom line for this is to know the purposes of asset security, also understand the purpose of identifying asset, understand the PII, PHI proprietary data, and know each of the classification level we talk about here in this video.